I am the close brother of a gangster. On the day he was killed, I stood in front of him and was stabbed more than a dozen times, then died first. In the blink of an eye, I was back to being 18 years old. When I thought about my brother being betrayed by his first love, I decided to stand up. Boss, I'll let you sleep as long as you don't go out and fight. Charles took 3 steps back in shock. What the hell is wrong with you? You're taller and stronger than me. An hour later, he was still not satisfied. It smells so good. 1. I was awakened by some voices. There was no blood and no pain. James, don't worry. If that rich kid dares to stalk and harass you, I'll beat him so hard that he won't be able to get out of bed for 3 months. Charles's casual voice floated into my ears. I glanced around. This is not one of Charles's luxurious villas, but a simple dormitory with bunk beds. After getting Charles's promise, James not only didn't smile, but his face was full of worry. Forget it. I was just complaining casually. Don't do anything stupid. I couldn't help but crack my knuckles. Although I have a simple brain, I still couldn't really understand what a raider was until I died. But I know that Charles is one of the male protagonists in James' system mission. James kept luring Charles into the position of a gangster, but sold out the information at the last minute and killed him. Now I have crawled back from hell. I will not let Charles follow in his old ways. I don't want my savior to die after only living for 30 years. When James saw me get out of bed, he said he was leaving. He is studying at the top university in Beijing, which is a world of difference between him and people like me and Charles who just graduated from high school and started working. After closing the door, Charles's face immediately darkened and he made a phone call to call someone. Check this bastard's schedule for me and call 2 brothers over. I grabbed Charles's arm. He patted my shoulder with his backhand, and the corner of his mouth curled up slightly in a sly smile. Don't worry, I will definitely take you with me. I frowned. Boss, could you please stop fighting? Charles looked at me strangely. Ha! You don't have a fever, do you? He really won't listen to me. I thought hard, thinking about how James had gotten Charles to do what he said in the past. Seems like seduction? I opened my arms and slammed Charles into my chest. Boss, let's be good people and stop doing these dirty jobs. As long as you agree, I can sleep with you. The next second, Charles broke free and twisted my arms behind my back, pressing me down on the table. What the hell is wrong with you? You're taller and stronger than me. There was a small mirror standing in the corner of the table, reflecting Charles and me. Why didn't I realize that James and I are not the same type at all? He is like a little prince, and I'm just a little brother. I don't understand. How can it be comfortable to hug that skinny body with protruding bones? I think I look good the way I am, with full muscles, nice breasts, and a nice butt, too. Charles was pressed against me, warm. He held me with his arms and legs, and we couldn't help rubbing against each other when he cursed excitedly. Suddenly, I felt a sense of emptiness on my back. Charles let go and took several steps back. I looked back and actually saw an unnatural look on his handsome face. There's hope. Anyway, the reason why he listened to James so much was because he wanted to sleep with him. And I always feel hung up and can't fall asleep. Then can't I just let him sleep? Anyway, we only live in one house, which is very convenient. Charles was so angry that he laughed. I really like him. You know. I stood up and took off my shirt, and Charles stopped talking. He looked hard at my chest. It made me feel a little shy. I know I have a good figure with broad shoulders, long legs, and well-proportioned muscles. In my previous life, after Charles's status became higher and higher, there were people who wanted to climb into my bed. There are many men and women. There are even some who are unrestrained and have fun. They don't want money or anything else. They just want to have a romantic moment with me. I kept Charles's words in mind and stayed away from sex. He said that people in our line of work need to be most careful about the people next to their beds. Don't underestimate these little lovers who are weak and have no offensive power. Many big guys have failed in this matter. He said it so clearly, but in the end he was still killed by James, that evil person. So I'm not going to listen to him this time. Anyway, I will never betray the boss. So it's okay to take a nap. Charles's Adam's apple rolled, and his tone of resistance became much weaker. He glanced at me and said, "Your pectoral muscles are quite big. The waist is strong too. Are you really letting me play?" An hour later, I held his head and pulled it out of my chest. "That's enough. They're all played to death." Charles licked his lips, his eyes full of regret and an expression of deep pain. "I really misjudged you. You look so honest, but your body is quite sexy." My face is a little red. I've been with him in the underworld for so long, and I've heard people call me cruel, laugh at me for being stupid, and say I'm loyal. But the word saw has nothing to do with me. Boss, let's not do this here with William. William runs an underground card room and also lends money at high interest rates. Charles's smile faded. He came out with a cigarette, and when he saw that I didn't move, he kicked me lightly. "Light the fire. What do you think of my younger brother's eyesight?" I was a little dazed. After all, as far as I can remember, Charles has quit smoking for 5 years. Because once he was thrown into an ice hole. I jumped in after him and tried my best to rescue him. As a result, my throat was injured and my lungs were not in good condition. The smell of smoke can make me cough so much that I get a side stitch. Charles stopped smoking after that. Not only does he not smoke himself, he also does not allow others to smoke in front of me. Once when I was negotiating a business deal, a blind guy on the other side deliberately blew smoke into my face. The attitude is very arrogant. Who on the street doesn't smoke? Charles, your dog is more pretentious than a woman. The next day, I heard that this guy was beaten up, his past was exposed, and he was sent to jail. I asked Charles if he did it. He crossed his legs and smiled. "If you don't want to mix, then don't mix. Send him to quit smoking." My thoughts came back to me and I felt warm inside. I never regret following Charles. He is very nice to me. "Boss, please quit smoking. After resigning from William, we have to save money." Charles sneered and looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "You don't want to be the younger brother anymore? You want to be the older sister-in-law?" He stood up, put his hands on the top of my head and rubbed it hard. Charles is a little over 1.80 meters tall, but I am 5 centimeters taller than him. I obediently and naturally lowered my head slightly to facilitate his movements. He told me not to forget that he still owed William $2 million. In fact, the one who really owed the money was his bastard gambling father, who ran away leaving Charles, who was still in high school, and his sick wife. Resigning is called quitting in a serious company. If I say I quit, William will stab me twice tonight. Do you believe it? Of course I know. So I plan to get some money to help Charles pay off his debts. Charles took my words as a joke. But soon he couldn't laugh anymore and narrowed his eyes quickly. "You dare to go out and sell your ass? You're my fucking dog." I think he has a pretty big imagination. I'm just trying to draw on memories and experiences from a past life. I know who the real male protagonist James is targeting is. A few days later, he went to the bar to celebrate James' birthday, and the two were almost raped by a group of drug-addled thugs. Fortunately, James called Charles in time and beat the gangster up severely. He was even promoted by William because he accidentally overthrew his enemy's men. At that time, Charles said to me happily, "Hey, James is my lucky star." What a lucky star, it's obviously a source of disaster. 3. In the bar, I picked a good seat and stared at the box door silently. Soon, a group of people stumbled in. There are all rich young masters and young ladies in there. How can they be a match for those drug-addicted people who don't care about their lives? As far as I can remember, only the target of James' strategy had some courage. He fought back desperately, but his arm was cut by a knife. I downed the drink in my hand and got up to go over. In my previous life, I also followed Charles to have this fight. At that time, I was inexperienced and was stabbed twice by the violent and crazy thug. This time, it's different. An 18-year-old's body and a 30-year-old's skills, it's simply amazing. The high drug thugs are crazy, but I don't take them seriously, because I'm more ruthless and accurate. After knocking down the last person, all the expensive foreign liquor shattered into glass shards. I walked up to Robert, amidst the wailing sounds on the ground. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed strangely. Turned out that he drank wine with added ingredients. No wonder he has lost his fighting power like a weakling. James hid behind Robert, covering his torn silk shirt with his hands, his eyes red from crying. In his previous life, Charles went crazy after seeing this scene and attacked without restraint. Because of this incident, he had no choice but to board William's ship completely and even became the helmsman. Robert stared at me, his eyes bright. "Excuse me, who are you?" I gave him my name and reached out to help him up. Robert asked me if we could take him to the hospital. I pointed upwards and told him to get a room and just do it himself. After all, this thing just needs to be metabolized. Maybe I spoke too harshly. Robert's face turned even redder. "Well, the injury on my arm needs treatment." I pulled his hand over to check and saw that there was only a little skin breakage, but the cut was a bit long. "This is just a minor injury that can be healed in the hospital." I asked him to go up first and I bought some gauze and iodine to help him deal with it. As we talked, James stopped sobbing and came over to Robert to support him. "How can this be? I'd better take you to the hospital." I want to say something, but my mouth is too dumb. I can only watch Robert and let him make his own choice. He looked at James deeply and gently pushed his hand away. "James, too much has happened tonight. I want to be alone." When I went to the nearby drugstore to buy something and groped my way into Robert's room, he had already finished his shower. She was wearing only a short white bath towel and was sitting at the end of the bed, wiping her hair. The wound on his arm had turned slightly white from being soaked in water. Seeing there was no stool nearby, I knelt down on one knee and rubbed some iodine on it to disinfect it. When I was wrapping the gauze carefully, water droplets dripped onto my forehead. Robert lowered his eyes and looked at me intently. "I really don't know how to thank you for what happened tonight." I've been waiting for him to say this. "You seem to be quite rich. Can you lend me $2 million?" Robert was stunned. The next second, the half-closed door was kicked open and Charles rushed in with a sullen face. When he saw me kneeling in front of Robert, his face turned murderous. "How dare you come out and sell yourself out? Do you want me to beat you to death?" James hid behind him and only half of his figure could be seen. Robert also recognized Charles. The three of them used to go to the same high school. "Charles is different from me. He is smart and quick-witted and used to have good grades. If his gambling father hadn't run away and people hadn't come to his door every day to collect debts, he wouldn't be like this now." With a hand on my shoulder, Robert leaned closer to me. "If you become my personal bodyguard, I will agree to your request." I was immediately delighted. Charles laughed, but his voice was as cold as a knife. "Michael, stand up and come back with me." Choose between Charles and Robert. Even if I'm not smart, I wouldn't be stupid enough to choose Robert, unless I really don't want to live. I followed Charles, who remained silent all the way, back to the small dormitory. I was feeling very nervous. His former nickname in the underworld was the Smiling Wolf, but he was most terrifying when he didn't smile. As soon as the door was closed, Charles asked me to take off my clothes. I silently lifted up my shirt. Charles's eyes suddenly spit fire. "Why are there so many marks? Was it caused by that beast Robert?" I am speechless. Charles has been in high spirits since I told him I would sleep with him that day. An 18-year-old man is at the peak of his energy. Even if he is exhausted from watching the scene until dawn, he will turn into a pervert as soon as he returns to the small dormitory. I didn't escape his clutches this morning either. Charles then stroked his chin. "It's been half a day and it hasn't gone away yet? I'll be gentler next time." Seeing that he was smiling again, I boldly said that I didn't plan to work with William anymore. Charles is smart and capable, but he is in debt and can't leave. But I was just an insignificant follower, and William didn't even know who I was. "Charles, I saved Robert today. He promised to lend me $2 million. You can use it to pay off your debt." Charles's fingers twirled, and a thin blade moved flexibly. "The condition is that you become his personal bodyguard?" I nodded, earning a sneer. "You bastard bodyguard. I think he's just hiring a prostitute. How can such a beast in human form be so kind?" As far as I knew before I died, Robert was not that kind of person, but I could understand why Charles hated him. After all, both of them, like James, and the rivals are extremely jealous when they meet. But he was really overthinking it. How could a nobleman like Robert, who came from a wealthy family, be interested in someone like me? Charles was very unhappy and asked me what kind of person I was. Who could I be? He is an orphan abandoned by his biological parents. They are a poor family who were raised by a disabled grandmother who picked up garbage. He is a poor fellow who is bullied and insulted by his peers. When I was 16, I was kicked and thrown into a garbage dump by a school bully. Here you are again, picking up plastic bottles. How much can you sell them for? Kneel down and bark like a dog, and I'll give you some pocket money. My face was swollen and the corners of my mouth were stinging. This person has been bullying me for half a year. If my grandma hadn't been expecting me to continue my studies, I would really want to drop out of school. Go pick up trash somewhere else, at least you won't get beaten every day. I dropped my eyes and curled up as usual. Anyway, they will leave when they are tired of fighting and find it boring. As a result, that day I waited for a different ending. That was also my first encounter with Charles. He walked over carrying an iron rod in one hand and smiled with his eyes narrowed. The school bully and his younger brother were arrogant at first and told Charles not to meddle in their affairs. Soon they were beaten and fled away in panic. Charles pulled me out of the garbage and made a tisk. What's the use of being so tall? He squeezed my thin arm again and said, "Come with me. I'll buy you some meat buns." Later, Charles fed me until I was tall and strong and gave me a home. The word home doesn't seem quite appropriate. One nest then. Charles didn't know that I was recalling the past and was still talking. Do you remember the place we went to last time? Don't think that rich people are noble. In fact, they are very perverted. They put on masks in private and play harder than the other. Then, according to what you said, James is not a good person either. Charles's face turned pale. I thought he was going to beat me up. In the past, anyone who dared to say anything bad about James would definitely be severely punished by Charles. But after waiting for a long time, he didn't move. James is different. When I was in trouble in high school, he encouraged me, brought me food, and even wanted to tutor me. I have heard these words many times. In my previous life, every time Charles got drunk, he would pull me over and repeat them over and over again. But this person, whom he regarded as his savior, ruthlessly betrayed Charles for the sake of another more important target. Then I won't look for Robert anymore, and you are not allowed to look for James anymore. Okay? Charles was silent, staring at me with his back teeth clenched, and it took him a while to squeeze out the word, okay, from between his teeth. That night, he didn't let me go back to the upper bunk and fell asleep with his head buried in my chest. I held his jaw and quietly pulled it out. It's incredibly swollen. I know Charles is just trying to keep me steady temporarily. It's not easy for him to suddenly ignore James. We can only be careful and cautious. Sure enough, just 1 week later, he deliberately asked people to go downstairs to buy midnight snacks, and specifically asked for the most popular fried skewers restaurant. Looking at the long line, I was thinking about whether I should just pay several times more money to exchange seats with the person in the front, when someone patted my shoulder. Looking at Robert behind me, I thought silently, if two people violated the rules at the same time, can we be considered even? 5. Robert and I found a table and sat down. Robert wasn't very surprised to hear that I couldn't go over to be his bodyguard. You didn't contact me for a week. I guessed it. It's Charles who won't let you go. I nodded obediently, and Robert's face turned slightly cold. He advised me to leave Charles as soon as possible. If you continue to follow him, nothing good will happen. There is indeed no good result. I have experienced it myself. But there was no way I could leave Charles. Even if I die again, I plan to die by his side. Robert, if you really want to help me, don't let your boyfriend come to Charles. Robert frowned slightly. You mean James? He is not my boyfriend. Now it was my turn to be surprised. If I remember correctly, when he died in his previous life, he and James flew abroad to get married. Robert said that because of what happened at the bar last time, his family was still very angry and felt that James was a big trouble. It's strange to say, but since I met James, I have often encountered accidents. I remained silent. After all, what kind of strategy and system does this sound ridiculous? Michael, I will still transfer the 2 million to you as a reward for saving my life that night. I thought about it and finally refused. This amount of money is really nothing to him, and may even be less than the cost of buying things for a trip abroad. But I have followed Charles for 14 years, and I know that everything in this world has its stakes marked. The richer a person is, the more shrewd they are. They may remain silent at first, but in the end they often get back the benefits with interest. Although I don't think there is anything about me that is worthy of Robert's calculation. I was planning to use this money to pay off Charles's debt. If he doesn't want it, then I don't want it either. Seeing that half an hour had passed, I stood up and prepared to leave. Robert hurriedly caught up. What about paying off the debt? There's always a way, and I've got a plan. But there's no need to tell Robert this. I'm not familiar with him. I quickly returned to the dormitory and opened the door, only to find it was pitch black inside. I was just about to turn on the light when I heard a click and a flash of orange light. The smell of smoke dissipated. Charles, what happened to my moody boss? Charles poked forward with the cigarette, and then flames lit up one by one. The cake in front of him slowly appeared. I couldn't help swallowing. It's not because of greed, it's because of fear. How could I forget that today is my birthday? I was abandoned by my parents and should not have known my date of birth. My grandma considers the day she picked me up as my birthday. Charles didn't recognize this day. He took it upon himself to regard the day he rescued me and brought me home as my birthday. The warm candlelight shone on Charles's gloomy face. It didn't feel like a birthday celebration, but rather like a dismemberment. If you don't go to Robert, I won't go to James. Did you say that? I quietly wiped the sweat from my palms with the seams of my pants. The balcony of the dormitory building faced the snack street, and he saw it as expected. I didn't look for him. He came here on his own. Charles gave a short snort of laughter. Very good, you even learned to talk back. Come here. I quickly walked over to him. I'm just blowing up a balloon here like an idiot, and you're meeting up with some weird guy outside? I thought he sent me away so he could meet James, but it turned out to be a birthday surprise for him. I quickly squatted down to comfort him. The large palm stroked his arm up and down, like a little brother trying to please the alpha wolf. I am very familiar with this process. Charles, I was wrong. Charles glanced at me and said nothing. In the candlelight, I took off my shirt, jeans, and underwear little by little. The next second, the cool cream was spread on my chest. I should just eat you instead of eating the cake. 6. When I woke up, it was already afternoon. Charles tossed me around all night last night. He also set a lot of rules. For example, when being beaten, he had to bite the quilt with his mouth and was not allowed to beg for mercy. If you dare to admit defeat, you will be beaten even harder. Actually, I am familiar with all these rules. In the past, when Charles taught his men a lesson and punished traitors, he was 100 times more brutal than this. It's not like I haven't made mistakes, but none of them had been as hard as last night. It is true that being a sister-in-law is much harder than being a younger brother. I no longer envy those mistresses who serve the big bosses. Charles had a satisfied look on his face, like a wild beast that had eaten its fill of meat, lying lazily and licking its paws. Seeing that he was in a good mood, I took the opportunity to talk about my future plans. I want to set up a stall in the snack street downstairs. My butt was pinched immediately. Are you serious? I nodded. Couldn't be more serious. Can you cook? Yes, fried pork chop. I happened to learn this from a master chef in my previous life, and it's a secret recipe passed down from generation to generation. Even Charles, who was used to eating all kinds of delicacies from land and sea, praised the dish as really delicious. The loosened steak is marinated in a secret sauce for several hours, coated with breadcrumbs and egg liquid, and fried for 3 minutes. Golden and crispy, tongue tender. Most people can't do this job, but I have strong hands. The master praised me for being a good pork chop seller and said that if I sold midnight snacks, I would definitely earn $30,000 a month. I said it very seriously and with full anticipation. When I was little, my dream was to be a chef so that my grandma wouldn't have to pick up rotten vegetable leaves and could eat clean meals every day. Charles put his arm around me and listened quietly. Finally, he said yes. Charles, when I make money, I'll pay the interest first and then you can slowly withdraw. Don't fight anymore. This time, Charles didn't call me crazy, nor did he refuse immediately. Instead, he buried his head in my chest. His breath hit my skin. I'll think about it. The snack stand was soon opened. Except for the first day when business was average, it became very popular and long queues formed afterwards. I'm not surprised. I'm confident in my craft. I made a lot of money. But Charles was not happy. Because the midnight snacks have to be served until the early morning, I am so tired every day that I fall asleep as soon as I get home. Charles was angry because he couldn't play with his little brother. Although he was also working at night, at least he had rotating rest days. But I didn't. If you work one day less, you earn one day less. So today, I was woken up by his kiss in the middle of my sleep. Charles said he looked at my account book and told me to limit the number of copies to 300 per day and close the stall once they were sold out. But I only sell about 300 copies a night? Charles pulled his mouth away in the middle of a rush. That's why we have to come up with some gimmicks to gather customers together, so that we can close the stall earlier and attract others to line up to grab the stalls. If you work hard and bury your head in work, you will die of exhaustion sooner or later. How does the saying go? I'm afraid of hooligans who are educated. Charles, when did you tell William to leave? Charles smacked his lips and said it would be soon. He also said that it was thanks to my hard work in frying pork chops that I paid the interest for him. When the time comes, I'll help Michael. How about I become your younger brother? I was amused by him. James hasn't come to see you recently, has he? Charles pinched my butt hard and said that I couldn't hold back a few words normally. But why did I talk so much nonsense in bed? He sent me messages several times, but I was busy and didn't reply in time. Charles said he found it strange too. In the past, if I didn't see James for a day, I would miss him like I was poisoned. I haven't seen you for more than 2 months now, and it doesn't seem to be that hard. I breathed a sigh of relief. 7. When I saw James at the stall, I realized that I was too reassured too early. He stared at me, smiling at the sign. Limited to 300 servings per day? Boss, I'll take all the remaining tonkatsu you have today. My heart sank slightly. Seeing that he didn't look surprised at all, it didn't seem like he ran into me by chance, but rather he had known that I was setting up a stall here for a long time. Following behind James was a young, rich second-generation man dressed in branded clothes, but with a very impetuous temperament. There were 3 other men who came with him. They were also dressed very fashionably, with nose rings and lip piercings, and they looked nonchalant and laughing. I can knock 2 of these pretentious fellows away with just one punch. The people queuing behind looked unhappy. What's going on? We've been waiting in line for half an hour. That's right, why would one person buy so much? Boss, you have to leave some for us. I deftly put the pork chops into the pan and said that each person could only buy 5 servings at most. The rich second generation looked at me arrogantly and provocatively. What if I have to take care of everything today? I wiped the sweat from my forehead. Then get out of here. The rich second generation suddenly got angry. He winked and the people behind him waved their hands and threw the things on my stall to the ground. You don't want to sell us? Then I'll make sure you can't sell anyone. After uttering harsh words, several people picked up stools and small tables and smashed them wildly, even pushing the customers waiting in line behind them. The guests' faces were filled with fear and they scattered one after another. In the blink of an eye, the long line was gone. They laughed triumphantly. Boss, can we come to patronize you every day from now on? Let's see who has the guts to come to your pork chop stand, you stupid pig. Veins bulged on the back of my hands, but I didn't do anything. Knowing that James had bad intentions, I would not fall into his trap impulsively. I bent down and tried to pick up the things on the ground bit by bit. Some things weren't broken, they just had a few dents, and they can still be used if you press them. My hand was deliberately stepped on and crushed. Look at him. Ha 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 ha. He's like a dog. In a second, the person who was speaking had his head grabbed by a hand and slammed hard against the cart I was using to sell his goods. There was a loud clang sound that shook the earth. Charles held a cigarette in his mouth and put his hands in his pockets. The guy who hit me laughed at me. Michael, I told you not to hang out with the boss, but you insisted on selling pork chops and ended up being bullied by this jerk. Brothers number 2 and number 3 also locked the necks of the other two with their arms. They smiled and raised the pliers in their hands, gestured to each other about the nails and rings piercing their faces, and said they wanted to pull them out one by one for fun. The two men were so frightened that their faces turned pale and they begged for mercy loudly. Charles looked at the rich second generation next to James and asked him if he could read. The rich second generation looked pale and tried to remain calm. Charles walked over step by step and dragged him towards the boiling oil pot. I'm asking you if you can read. Can you understand that this sign says Charles fried pork chops? You blind idiot. You dare to mess with someone I'm protecting? Charles's fist hit the rich second generation's face again and again. Even though I rushed over and tried to pull them apart, the rich second generation still had a bruised face and nose, and 2 of his teeth were knocked out. He covered his face with his hands, his face filled with horror and disbelief. Do you know who my father is? Charles shook the blood off his hands and said he knew. I am your father. The rich second generation was furious and trembling. He took out his cell phone to call the police, shouting that Charles and I must pay the price. William said as he led us out of the police station. Charles, how are you going to repay this favor? Charles said he agreed and would go for the big job. But after finishing this job, he still has to leave. William squinted his triangular eyes, smiled and said okay. How could I not see from the look in his eyes that Charles couldn't get away? At this moment, I really hated James. I actually know the rich second generation tonight. It was because James complained that he couldn't get rid of his pestering that Charles went over to teach him a lesson in his previous life. In the end, he had to rely on the power above William to protect him and help them do more and more dirty work. Obviously, I have already persuaded Charles once. Obviously, he also said that he would slowly withdraw from William's business. But James chose to bring people to me to cause trouble, causing Charles to go back to his old ways. 3 days later, I received a call. Something happened to Charles. I heard that he suffered a lot of injuries and his head was broken in order to protect the important person. This has never happened in even the previous lifetime. I left the pork chop stall and hurried to the clinic. Charles was wrapped in gauze and unconscious. I sat on a stool without a back and didn't sleep a wink all night. In the early hours of the morning, Charles developed a high fever. I didn't panic and quickly applied ice and changed the bandages for him. I don't know if Charles was having a nightmare or what, but he suddenly grabbed my wrist tightly and called my name intermittently. I leaned over and tried to make out what he was saying. Michael, Michael, don't go. Don't go. I haven't shed tears for a long time, and my eyes are feeling sore now. She leaned down and gently touched his cracked lips. Charles, I will always be with you until death. In my previous life, there was one thing I couldn't figure out. Charles always said how good James was to him and that he was the light in his dark life. I don't understand. Didn't I just give him 2 rice balls in high school? And didn't I just say a few words of encouragement when he was looked down upon by others? How powerful could it be? I stayed with Charles for 14 years, cooked for him and took bullets for him. I don't think I'm any worse than James. Not to mention, James has ulterior motives. I really don't know what's wrong with these men. They are all driven crazy by James. 9. It was already noon the next day when Charles woke up. His eyes were still confused and filled with great pain. Michael! I reached out and checked the temperature and the fever was gone. I'm here. Are you hungry? He looked me up and down in disbelief, then looked around, and finally suddenly stood up and hugged me. I was so scared that I quickly pushed the person down on the bed. The wound burst open. Charles laughed slowly, until his laughter became almost insane. I couldn't help but wonder, did he get a brain injury and become a fool? Anyway, I'm glad everything's okay. I can go out to set up the stall again in the evening. Charles paused while drinking water. You said you were going to sell fried pork cutlets? Yes, people like us don't have time to be delicate and pretentious. Making money is important. But I still kissed him on the lips to coax him a little. Anyway, you can sleep and recover at night. and I'll come back and take care of you during the day." Charles's eyes widened and his body froze, the water spilling onto his chest. I saw him covering his head, probably because he was feeling uncomfortable again. When I came back from the pork chop stall, I found a row of my younger brothers standing neatly beside the bed. Charles leaned against the head of the bed, flipping through some documents with his bandaged hands. He looked not like a pitiful patient, but rather like a powerful boss. "Why are you sitting up? Your wound hasn't healed yet." Charles closed the file and said lazily, "It's just a minor injury. It's not like there's no—" He didn't finish his sentence, and I didn't care. I picked a big red apple and started peeling it. Charles glanced at them, and the group of younger brothers said in unison that they would do the job as instructed, and then left quickly. I cut the apple into small pieces. "What errand is William?" The plate was handed to Charles, but he opened his mouth and motioned for me to feed him. I picked up a piece and stuffed it in, and couldn't help but sigh. The next second, Charles pinched his chin. "You don't like serving me?" I whimpered and shook my head. "I just worry about the future. In the future, a stubborn guy like me will actually think about such advanced things." Charles seemed to see through me and raised the corner of his mouth. "Do you think I got all these injuries in vain? From now on, William can't control me anymore." "What's the difference?" "It's not just William. There's also Brother Lee and Brother Wong. They're all on the same path." "Silly Michael. You are older than me and you have hooked up with someone very rich." He announced a name and my mouth dropped open in surprise. Of course I know this old man. On the road, he is a well-deserved legend. 9 out of 10 people who follow this path will not have a good ending and will not die a good death. The only exception is him, nicknamed Thomas, because everyone said that he crossed his name out of the book of life and death. Of course, his strength does not lie in his tough life. Instead, he transformed himself, split the industry into two, set up a company and became Thomas. As the saying goes, it is completely cleansed. "Michael, I will listen to you and will not take that dangerous road again. I am so happy." "Then you have to reward me?" "Ah." Of course I could see the impatience in his eyes. "But can he do it now?" Charles licked his lips and told me to sit on it and move myself. "This kind of black clinic is convenient for doing anything, and no one will bother you." 10. A few days later, I closed my stall and returned to the clinic as usual. What he saw was James sitting in front of the bed. I quietly leaned against the wall and eavesdropped on their conversation. James kept thanking Charles for helping him get rid of that annoying rich second generation. "Fortunately, you received my message and came in time to solve the problem." My chest heaved. I was angry. Sure enough, it was James, the troublemaker, who deliberately started trouble that day and called Charles over to drag him into the water. This trick always works for him. "Charles, you are so powerful now. You have so many thugs." James' tone was filled with just the right amount of admiration as he said that the rich second generation had a wealthy family and connections, and ultimately would not be able to do anything to Charles. Charles said, "Of course. If I'm not strong, how can I protect the one I love?" James smiled, his tone full of anticipation. "Charles, if you go up further, no one in the entire city of A will dare to mess with us anymore, right?" I held the handle of the insulated box tightly, thinking that if nothing worked, I would just find a dark and windy day to squash the annoying fly to death. Charles sneered, his voice lazy. "We? Who told you we are? Michael and I are us." I was stunned. James probably did the same, his tone stuttering. "How can you talk like that? Don't forget when we were in school. It was me." He didn't say anything before Charles interrupted him impatiently. "Did you buy me those rice balls from the convenience store? Or did you comfort me and cheer me up? Am I blind or have I been bewitched? How could I be so confused? You are a scum who takes advantage of others and betrays others. You deserve to be chopped off 100 times. I was able to climb to a high position not because of your lip service, but because of Michael's hard work and blood and sweat. If you dare to appear in front of us again, I won't mind chopping you up and feeding you to the fish." That day, James' face was pale and he almost stumbled away. After Charles recovered from his injury and was discharged from the hospital, Thomas took him away from William. On the day I left, I saw William bowing his head and trying to smile. Charles, we brothers will have to rely on your care from now on. That's how it is in the underworld. People call each other brother, based on their status, regardless of age. He no longer lived in the dormitory, and Thomas directly allocated him a large house. At first I was reluctant to move there. It's too high-end. There are no snack streets or night markets nearby. Charles hugged me and was almost dying of laughter. Still setting up a stall? Can't you just open a small shop in the park and hire a few employees? You don't know how to be flexible at all. As soon as he finished speaking, he tightened his arms and I could hardly breathe. It's better to be a little stupid. I like it. In my previous life, I lived for 30 years before I realized that being too serious in life is also a kind of stupidity. Being Charles's little brother for decades is stupid. Willingly letting him drive you around, stupid. It's stupid to do anything to block the knife for him. Everyone laughed at how a ruthless character like Charles actually left his back to a stupid dog. But everyone was extremely jealous, envying that Charles had someone Michael to rely on. In the following days, Charles became very busy. Working under the King of Hell is not an easy job. Although I know that Charles's current affairs are not very clean, at least there is hope for the future. It doesn't matter. There are still many years before you turn 30. I wonder how many tonkatsu chain stores I will be able to open by then. Charles yanked off his tie and unbuttoned his collar. He wore the high-end shirt and suit in a loose and sloppy way. Handsome to the core. He laughed at me for being so incompetent. I plan to go back to school and take the adult self-taught exam. Do you want to join me? I waved my hands quickly. I'm not like Charles. He went to watch the scene after graduating from high school because he was forced to do so by life. I simply couldn't pass the exam and didn't want to continue studying. It's a good thing that he wants to learn again. But why did he suddenly have such an idea? I'm going to take over the old man's company in the future, so I'll have to rely on my brains and education to fight. It's only been a short time and you've already coveted someone else's property? But it's true. Thomas has a lot of mistresses, but no wife or children. Wasn't this the reason why Charles targeted him in the first place? While I was massaging him to relax him, I was thinking about all sorts of things. Soon I felt dizzy and was pressed down on the sofa. Didn't you say you were tired? Charles touched me all over. His movements were a little impatient. He lifted my clothes and immediately left a few bite marks. They are all gone. I'll give you a new label. I pushed him and wanted to go back to my room and go to bed. Charles smiled maliciously and said that the sofa has its own advantages. As I was sweating profusely, I gradually felt that the sofa was getting better. Because of limited space, the two big men had to stack together tightly. Even when changing movements or moving positions, you should support yourself with your hands and keep your legs close to each other. At that time, the surroundings seemed to have turned into a vast ocean, and I had the illusion that I would drown if I fell in. The sofa became a small boat, a Noah's Ark belonging to Charles and me in the rapids. 11. After my life got back on track, I brought my grandmother and Charles's mother over. Charles was happy but not too happy. The reason is that he can no longer do whatever he wants in every corner of the house. So he worked harder, saying that he wanted to get rid of the old man as soon as possible and take his place. Then I'll buy the house across the street as well. I chuckled in my heart. In the past, he had many large villas. However, I like his current thinking better. The bigger the house, the farther people are from each other. One afternoon, Charles called me out of the blue and said that he had come up with a big project and wanted me to go to his company in person to deliver 200 portions of fried pork chops and drinks as a reward for afternoon tea for the employees. I was so busy that I finally got there, only to see Charles and Robert in suits walking out of the conference room. When Charles saw me, he introduced me without hesitation. My boyfriend. Robert had a fake business smile on his face, but it completely disappeared after hearing this. Charles, Michael, and I only met a few times 2 years ago. You don't have to be so childish. But Charles sneered. Robert still remembers the name of someone he met a few times 2 years ago so well? This was so embarrassing that I quickly stuffed the fried pork chop in my hand into Charles's hand. I made an extra portion just for you. He frowned and scolded me. Didn't I say I was discussing business with Robert? Why didn't you make one for him as well? He never told me. Robert smiled again and said to me, "So you opened a shop nearby? The fried pork chops smell so good. How about I go back with you and you make me another one?" Charles's face instantly turned sour. "I know this is called shooting oneself in the foot. Charles, Thomas wants you to come up." Charles gritted his teeth and had to leave first, but he warned me with his eyes not to make fried pork chops for Robert. Robert and I got into the elevator together. "I sent you several messages later. Why didn't you reply?" Without waiting for my answer, he said that Charles was too domineering. "They are all independent men. You don't have to listen to them." How could I dare to let Charles know that Robert contacted me? I'm not stupid and I don't want to die in bed. I just don't want to have anything to do with Robert. When I think of him, I think of James. He is James' real target. I just want James to stay away from Charles and not try to kill him again. As for whether other people are with he Mimi or break up, it has nothing to do with me. Seeing my silence, Robert smiled and said that he had never thought that one day he would discuss cooperation with someone like Charles. I subconsciously replied, "He is very talented and smart, and he is also very good at studying. What is a person like Charles?" Charles could have been a very good person if he had not been dragged into the quagmire step by step. It's not our fault that life plays tricks on us. Robert sighed. "He just got there before me." I seemed to understand, so I asked him, "What about James?" Robert's face flashed with disgust for a moment, and he said that he had seen through James' true face and had long distanced himself from him. This surprised me. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell Robert that he arrived not 2 years later than Charles, but 14 years later. Besides, he just talks. If it was really Robert who picked me up back then, he would at most treat me as a pet dog, and he would be the owner of the leash. But Charles is the leader who leads me in the fight, and we always stick together. 12. James hired someone to kidnap me. I was surprised to see him again after almost 2 years. He is very different from what I remember. Is this still the same James who was cool and elegant, with a look so exquisite that it was almost hard to tell whether he was androgynous? He gained a lot of weight, his complexion became dark yellow, and he had a lot of pimples on his nose and forehead. He held the knife in his hand and yelled at me hysterically. I was on high alert, but I didn't expect to be intercepted by a lowly thug like you. Are Robert and Charles blind? Don't be impulsive. You're committing a crime and you'll go to jail too. I didn't expect that after becoming a good person, there would be a day when I would be able to advise others. James was very disdainful and said that as long as the obstacle, disappeared, he would be able to attract Robert and Charles again. When the time comes, I can just find a gangster and give him some money to take the blame. What do I have to be afraid of? I don't know where he gets such confidence from. Is it because of that system? James shuddered and looked at me as if he had seen a ghost. How do you know the system? No. Are you also a captor? James was so frightened by my breaking the system that he couldn't even hold the knife steadily, which made me frown. Is he so dependent on that thing? What do you know? James yelled at me. As long as you complete the tasks one by one, you can exchange charm, intelligence, and luck with the system. Domineering CEOs, gangsters, and triple award winners. They will all fall in love with me and revolve around me. I still don't understand. Why do you need so many people to love you? I'm almost exhausted just dealing with Charles alone. I used the small folding blade in my back pocket to easily cut the ropes that bound my wrists. I'm not saying anything, but the professional skills of these thugs he hired are too poor. In the previous life, he was not even qualified to be Charles's younger brother. When James saw me break free and stand up, he was stunned. He kept saying, you, for a long time but didn't dare to come up and chop me. From the beginning, I knew he was useless. That hesitant and tangled look doesn't mean he's someone who's willing to fight to the death. James, do you know where you lost? He is too greedy. If he hadn't betrayed Charles and pushed him to the brink of death, I wouldn't have died and I wouldn't have been 18 again. He took advantage of the system to play with people's hearts, and he deserved the backlash. When Charles and his men rushed in, they saw James and a bunch of good-for-nothing thugs tied up in a row. They squatted there obediently like big carrots. The corners of Charles's mouth twitched slightly, and his expression was hard to describe. After James went in, Charles told me that he seemed crazy. I heard that he was howling all day long, shouting things like, "System, don't leave, don't abandon me," and so on. I kept silent and pretended not to understand. In this life, James seems to be just a small episode in Charles and I's lives. A year later, Charles finally found a kidney for her mother, and the operation was successful. I think his mother and my grandmother had been aware of our relationship for a long time, but they didn't say anything. Charles became the general manager and his promotion speed was comparable to that of the Rockets. I heard that Thomas was very satisfied with him, which also aroused the jealousy of many people. Those people tried to trip Charles up or down, but Charles dealt with them one by one. When I was 24, Charles booked a hotel to celebrate my birthday. As soon as I walked in, dozens of people stood up and shouted at me in unison, "Sister-in-law, happy marriage." Only then did I notice that the box was decorated very festively, not for a birthday but for a wedding. Looking over them one by one, these brothers all looked like old acquaintances. Many of them were with Charles and I in the previous life. I let myself get drunk. At night, when Charles was holding me in his arms, I couldn't help crying. He couldn't go on any longer, so he came over and kissed my eyelids. "Does it hurt?" His hands moved all over my body, and every spot was a place for me to block the knife. "Boss, I don't feel any pain, not at all." Charles bit the back of my neck and gritted his teeth, then smiled. "Why call me boss? Call me husband." 18-year-old Charles is good, but I can't forget 30-year-old Charles. Thanks for coming back with me.